The year is 49 BCE, and Rome stands on the brink of civil war. Tensions have been building for years between two of the most powerful figures of the time. Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, known to history as Pompey the Great. Caesar, who has been building a reputation as a brilliant military commander through his conquests in Gaul, now seeks to extend his influence into Roman politics. But his ambitions are met with fierce resistance from the Senate, led by Pompey. This story begins with a key moment: the siege of Corfinium, a relatively small city, but one that would set the tone for the rest of Caesar's campaign in Italy. At the heart of the confrontation was Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, an ardent supporter of Pompey and a man determined to resist Caesar at all costs. But to understand how Corfinium became the setting for one of the first engagements of the Civil War, we need to step back and explore the political climate leading up to the siege. Caesar had spent years campaigning in Gaul, building not only his military prowess, but also his political capital. His victories in Gaul had brought him immense wealth and a loyal army, but they had also made him many enemies in Rome. The Senate, fearful of Caesar's growing influence, ordered him to disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. For Caesar, this was unacceptable. He knew that without the protection of his legions, he would likely be prosecuted by his political enemies and his career brought to an end. His decision was clear. He would cross the Rubicon, the river that marked the boundary between Cisalpine Gaul and Italy, with his army, an act of war against the Senate. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he uttered the famous words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast. This single moment set into motion a series of events that would plunge the Roman Republic into a bloody civil war. Caesar moved swiftly into Italy, his legions marching south with surprising speed and efficiency. As he advanced, many cities surrendered to him without a fight, either out of loyalty to Caesar or out of fear of his formidable reputation. Corfinium, however, was different. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus had fortified the city and was prepared to resist. Domitius was a staunch supporter of Pompey and the Senate, and he believed that if he could hold out long enough, Pompey would send reinforcements. In his mind, Caesar's rapid advance could be checked, and the tide of the war turned in favour of the Senate. Domitius commanded a force of about 30 cohorts, roughly equivalent to 3 legions. While not an insignificant number, it was no match for Caesar's veteran troops in terms of experience and cohesion. When Caesar arrived at Corfinium, he quickly assessed the situation. He knew that a prolonged siege could be risky, as Pompey might indeed send reinforcements. But Caesar also knew that time was on his side. If he could end the siege quickly, it would send a strong message to other cities and provinces still on the fence about whether to support him or the Senate. Caesar decided to lay siege to the city, surrounding it with his legions and cutting off supplies. Inside the walls of Corfinium, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Domitius had overestimated his position, and as the days dragged on, it became clear that Pompey's reinforcements were not coming. Food supplies dwindled, and morale began to collapse. Domitius, realizing his mistake, attempted to flee the city in disguise. However, his own soldiers, frustrated by the lack of leadership and fearing Caesar's retribution, captured him and delivered him to Caesar. What happened next was surprising to many. Rather than executing Domitius and his men, Caesar pardoned them. This act of clemency was not born out of compassion, but rather cold political calculation. Caesar understood that a civil war would be long and bloody, and he needed to win over as many supporters as possible. By showing mercy, he hoped to convince others that surrendering to him would not result in punishment or death, but rather forgiveness and even reward. The siege of Corfinium ended without the kind of bloodshed that would later characterize Caesar's civil war. It was a decisive psychological victory for Caesar. His enemies saw that he was not only a brilliant tactician, but also a shrewd politician, capable of turning enemies into allies. With Corfinium in his control, Caesar now had a secure base in central Italy, and he quickly turned his attention to Pompey, who had retreated to the port city of Brundisium. The aftermath of the siege rippled throughout Italy. News of Domitius's surrender and Caesar's clemency spread quickly. Many cities that had been hesitant to declare their loyalty now swung in favor of Caesar. The Senate's forces, scattered and disorganized, could not mount a coordinated defense. Even among Pompey's ranks, there were whispers of doubt. Could Caesar truly be defeated? Could Pompey, despite his reputation as a great general, muster enough support to stop Caesar's seemingly unstoppable advance? For Domitius, the siege of Corfinium was a humiliation. He had placed his faith in Pompey, only to be abandoned and forced to surrender. While Caesar had spared him, Domitius would remain a bitter enemy of Caesar for the rest of the war. He would later join forces with Pompey once more, fighting against Caesar in the brutal campaigns that followed. But for Caesar, the siege of Corfinium was a masterstroke. It allowed him to consolidate his power in Italy without the need for a major battle. It demonstrated his willingness to be merciful, but also his capability to be decisive and ruthless when necessary. Caesar's march through Italy would continue unabated, and the stage was set for the next confrontation at Brundisium, where Pompey would make his stand, or so he thought. As we close this chapter of Caesar's civil war, it is important to reflect on the significance of these early engagements. The siege of Corfinium may not have been the bloodiest or the most dramatic of Caesar's campaigns, but it was pivotal in shaping the course of the war. It showcased Caesar's leadership, his ability to inspire loyalty, and his capacity for strategic thinking. It also set the tone for the brutal and unforgiving nature of the conflict that was to come. For Rome, this was just the beginning. The city that had once prided itself on its republican ideals was now on the verge of tearing itself apart. The civil war would rage on for years, and Caesar's path to ultimate victory would be filled with challenges, betrayals, and battles that would leave their mark on history. But for now, Caesar had secured his foothold in Italy, and the fate of the Roman Republic hung in the balance. After securing victory at Corfinium, Julius Caesar set his sights on a strategic objective, Brundisium, a key port in southern Italy. This city held immense significance for both military and political reasons. Pompey, Caesar's principal rival, had retreated to Brundisium with his forces, planning to use it as a launching point to escape across the Adriatic Sea to Greece. From there, Pompey intended to rally more troops and consolidate his position, preparing for a longer confrontation with Caesar. Caesar, determined to trap Pompey and force a decisive battle, moved swiftly to lay siege to the port city. As Caesar approached Brundisium, he understood the gravity of the situation. Pompey was one of Rome's most formidable commanders, and allowing him to escape would prolong the war and potentially swing momentum in Pompey's favor. Caesar's plan was straightforward: encircle the city, build fortifications, and prevent Pompey's forces from fleeing by sea. By doing so, he hoped to force Pompey into a direct confrontation on Roman soil, where Caesar's legions would have the upper hand. However, Pompey was no ordinary opponent. He had already assessed his situation, recognizing that Brundisium, while strategically important, was not defensible long-term, given Caesar's speed and the size of his army. Pompey had already ordered his engineers to fortify the city, but his true goal was not to hold Brundisium indefinitely. Instead, he intended to use the city as a temporary stronghold while preparing his fleet for a swift evacuation. Upon his arrival, Caesar ordered his engineers to begin the construction of siege works. Fortifications were erected around the city to cut off supply lines and reinforce the blockade. The walls of Brundisium were formidable, and Pompey's forces were well prepared to hold off Caesar's initial assaults. Caesar, a veteran of numerous sieges during his Gallic campaigns, knew this would be no easy task. Nevertheless, he pressed forward, directing his legions to cut off all routes of escape and surrounding the city with a sense of urgency. The days turned into weeks as the siege dragged on. Caesar's men worked tirelessly, building earthworks and trenches to isolate the city. Pompey, on the other hand, launched several sorties from within the city to disrupt Caesar's progress. These sudden, calculated attacks caused brief confusion among the besieging forces, but Caesar's troops quickly reformed and repelled the assaults. Pompey's goal wasn't to break the siege entirely, but to delay Caesar long enough for his escape plans to come to fruition. As the tension mounted, Caesar grew increasingly anxious. His primary concern was that Pompey might slip away, which would force Caesar into a prolonged conflict in foreign lands. Time was running out, and Caesar knew it. He pushed his legions to work faster, ordering them to construct a blockade in the harbour, intending to trap Pompey's fleet in the port. Caesar's forces began building a series of floating barricades to close off the harbour's entrance. This move was both ambitious and risky, as it required speed and precision to complete before Pompey could make his move. Despite Caesar's efforts, Pompey's preparations for evacuation were nearly complete. His fleet, one of the largest and most experienced in the Roman world, was ready to sail. Pompey had already begun loading his troops and supplies onto the ships under the cover of night. His engineers had also destroyed parts of the city's walls, creating a barrier of rubble that would slow down any attempt by Caesar's forces to breach the city and reach the docks. The siege reached its climax as Pompey ordered the final evacuation of his forces. With a carefully timed manoeuvre, Pompey's fleet sailed out of Brundisium's harbour just as Caesar's forces were completing their blockade. Caesar's legions, witnessing the escape, rushed to the docks, but it was too late. Pompey and his army had successfully slipped away, leaving Caesar standing at the water's edge, watching his enemy sail toward Greece. Caesar's frustration was palpable. Despite all his efforts, Pompey had outmaneuvered him, escaping to fight another day. The war, which Caesar had hoped to end quickly with a decisive victory at Brundisium, would now drag on across the Adriatic in a foreign land where Pompey's influence was strong. Nevertheless, Caesar remained undeterred. While Pompey had escaped, Caesar now controlled all of Italy. The Senate's forces had been driven out, and Caesar's position as the dominant power in Rome was solidified. His next step would be to pursue Pompey to Greece and force a confrontation on foreign soil. The significance of the siege of Brundisium cannot be understated. Although Pompey had managed to escape, the siege represented a turning point in Caesar's campaign. It demonstrated Caesar's resolve and his willingness to pursue his enemies wherever they fled. It also highlighted Pompey's strategic brilliance, as he managed to escape from under Caesar's nose, preserving his forces for the battles to come. As Caesar prepared his legions for the coming campaign in Greece, the larger conflict between Caesar and Pompey took on new dimensions. The struggle was no longer just about control of Rome. It was about control of the entire Roman world. With both leaders determined to emerge victorious, the siege of Brundisium was just the beginning of a conflict that would reshape the Roman Republic and determine the fate of its greatest leaders. After the siege, Pompey fled to Greece, where he began gathering reinforcements and preparing for a larger conflict with Caesar. Meanwhile, Caesar wasted no time. With Italy firmly under his control, he turned his attention to assembling a fleet to follow Pompey across the Adriatic. Caesar's confidence was unshaken, despite the frustrations at Brundisium. He knew that the ultimate confrontation with Pompey was inevitable, and when it came, it would be one of the defining moments of his career. The siege of Brundisium marked the end of the first phase of Caesar's civil war. While Pompey's escape was a setback, Caesar's rapid conquest of Italy was a testament to his strategic brilliance and his ability to inspire loyalty in his troops. The war was far from over, but Caesar had already demonstrated that he was a force to be reckoned with. The next phase of the war would take Caesar to Greece, where he would confront Pompey in a series of battles that would determine the future of Rome. In retrospect, the siege of Brundisium can be seen as a microcosm of the larger conflict between Caesar and Pompey. It was a battle of wits and strategy, with each commander attempting to outmaneuver the other. While Pompey ultimately escaped, the siege set the stage for the coming clashes that would decide the fate of the Roman Republic. For Caesar, it was both a lesson in the difficulty of war and a stepping stone toward greater victories to come. With Pompey's escape, The war would now spread across the Mediterranean, drawing in more cities, more legions, and more bloodshed. Caesar, always the opportunist, was ready for the challenge. His pursuit of Pompey would become the defining feature of the next phase of the war, leading to some of the most famous and decisive battles in Roman history. Brundisium had been the first test, but the war was only just beginning. Following Pompey's escape to Greece and the conclusion of the siege of Brundisium, Caesar set his sights on consolidating his control over the western provinces, particularly Spain. Spain was vital to Pompey's campaign, as it housed several legions loyal to him, commanded by his lieutenants Lucius Afranius and Marcus Petreius. To secure a more dominant position in the civil war, Caesar knew he needed to neutralize these forces before following Pompey to Greece. This set the stage for the Battle of Ilerda, a crucial encounter that would test both military strategies and the logistical acumen of both sides. In the early spring of 49 BCE, Caesar marched his forces across the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, an arduous task that showcased his determination and the loyalty of his troops. His goal was the city of Ilerda, modern-day Lleida, which was strategically located along the river Sicaris. Ilerda was an important stronghold for Pompey's forces and would become the epicenter of the coming battle. Caesar's army consisted of 6 legions, roughly 40,000 men, including cavalry and auxiliary forces. Afranius and Petreius, although experienced commanders, had a difficult task ahead of them. They commanded 5 legions, but they were positioned defensively, waiting for Caesar to make his move. Upon reaching Ilerda, Caesar quickly realized that the terrain surrounding the city favored the defenders. The city itself sat atop a hill, with the Sicaris River providing a natural barrier to the north. Afranius and Petreius had fortified their position on higher ground, overlooking the river and the surrounding plains. Their forces had established camps and were well provisioned for a protracted standoff. Caesar knew that a direct assault would be too costly, especially given the terrain. Instead, he sought to outmaneuver his enemies and force them into a vulnerable position. To achieve this, Caesar began constructing a series of fortifications and trenches on the lower plains near the river. His plan was to cut off Afranius and Petreius from their supply lines, forcing them to either surrender or engage in battle on less favorable terms. The key to this strategy was the control of the Sicaris River, as it was the primary source of water and supplies for both sides. Caesar ordered his engineers to build a bridge across the river, allowing his troops to cross and threaten Afranius and Petreius's supply routes. As the battle progressed, the situation became a test of logistics and endurance. Caesar's forces, though determined, were initially at a disadvantage due to heavy rains that caused the river to swell. The rising waters washed away the bridges and made it difficult for Caesar to resupply his troops. This led to a temporary crisis within his ranks, as food and provisions ran dangerously low. The morale of Caesar's men began to falter, and it seemed that Afranius and Petreius might be able to hold out indefinitely. Afranius and Petreius, however, failed to capitalize on Caesar's precarious situation. Rather than launching a counterattack or attempting to break the siege, they remained on the defensive, content to wait out the enemy. This hesitation would prove costly. Caesar, ever the master of adaptation, quickly found a solution to the rising waters. He ordered the construction of makeshift rafts and boats to ferry supplies across the river, restoring morale and ensuring that his army remained well provisioned. Caesar's ability to maintain the logistical support of his army, even in the face of natural obstacles, was a testament to his leadership and the ingenuity of his engineers. With his supply lines restored, Caesar resumed his strategy of outflanking Afranius and Petreius. He ordered his cavalry to cross the river and cut off the road leading south toward the Ebro River, which was the main supply route for the Pompeian forces. This maneuver was successful, and Afranius and Petreius soon found themselves in a dangerous position. They were now effectively cut off from reinforcements and supplies. The situation grew increasingly desperate for the Pompeian commanders. Realizing that they could no longer hold their position indefinitely, Afranius and Petreius decided to abandon Ilerda and withdraw southward in the hopes of joining forces with other Pompeian legions. However, Caesar was quick to respond. He ordered his legions to pursue the retreating army, cutting off their escape route and forcing them into a series of skirmishes along the way. These skirmishes further weakened the Pompeian forces, who were now running low on supplies and morale. The decisive moment came when Afranius and Petreius attempted to cross the river at a narrower point, hoping to escape Caesar's pursuit. Caesar anticipated this move and had already positioned his cavalry to block the crossing. Trapped and outnumbered, Afranius and Petreius had no choice but to surrender. Caesar, in a display of his usual clemency, spared the lives of the Pompeian soldiers, incorporating many of them into his own army. He also pardoned Afranius and Petreius, a move that further solidified his reputation as a merciful leader, even in the heat of civil war. The surrender at Ilerda marked the end of organized Pompeian resistance in Spain, and Caesar now had full control of the Iberian Peninsula. This victory was significant not only for the strategic advantage it gave Caesar, but also for the psychological blow it dealt to Pompey and his supporters. By neutralizing Pompey's legions in Spain, Caesar had removed a key base of support for his rival, forcing Pompey to rely more heavily on the forces he was gathering in Greece. While the Battle of Ilerda was not as large or as bloody as some of the other battles in the Civil War, it was a masterclass in strategy and logistics. Caesar's ability to adapt to the terrain, manage his supplies, and outmaneuver his opponents demonstrated his brilliance as a commander. The battle also highlighted the importance of mobility and the use of cavalry in ancient warfare. Caesar's legions, though initially disadvantaged by the terrain and weather, ultimately triumphed through superior planning and execution. In the aftermath of the battle, Caesar consolidated his control over Spain, leaving behind garrisons to maintain order and ensure that the region remained loyal to his cause. With the western provinces secure, Caesar turned his attention to the next phase of the war, the inevitable confrontation with Pompey in Greece. The campaign in Spain had been a critical success, but the final showdown with Pompey still loomed on the horizon. The Battle of Ilerda may not be as well known as some of Caesar's other victories, but it played a crucial role in shaping the outcome of the civil war. By defeating Afranius and Petreius, Caesar removed a major threat to his campaign and ensured that Spain would not be a base for Pompeian resistance. It also demonstrated Caesar's willingness to show mercy to his enemies, a tactic that would serve him well throughout the war. For Caesar, Ilerda was another step toward ultimate victory, but for Rome, it was a reminder of the growing divide that threatened to tear the Republic apart. The year 48 BCE saw Julius Caesar's pursuit of Pompey's forces lead him across the Adriatic Sea to Greece, where the next major confrontation of the civil war would take place. The Battle of Dyrrhachium was a critical moment in Caesar's campaign, one that nearly ended in disaster for him and his legions. Situated along the coast of the Adriatic, near modern-day Durrës in Albania, Dyrrhachium was a key stronghold for Pompey and his supporters. It was here that Pompey, bolstered by fresh reinforcements and a strong defensive position, planned to confront Caesar on his own terms. Following his victories in Spain and Italy, Caesar was confident in his ability to bring the civil war to a swift conclusion. His goal was to corner Pompey and force a decisive battle that would break Pompey's army and leave him with no choice but to surrender. Pompey, however, was not easily intimidated. He had gathered a formidable force of nearly 50,000 men, including a large number of cavalry and auxiliary troops from the eastern provinces. In contrast, Caesar's legions, although battle-hardened and loyal, were significantly outnumbered, with around 30,000 men. As Caesar's forces crossed the Adriatic and landed in Greece, they found themselves facing logistical challenges. The terrain was difficult, the supply lines were stretched, and the weather was often unpredictable. Despite these difficulties, Caesar remained determined to engage Pompey at Dyrrhachium. Pompey, for his part, chose to adopt a defensive strategy. He fortified his position around the city, using the natural landscape to his advantage. The hills and ridges surrounding Dyrrhachium provided Pompey with an excellent vantage point, allowing him to monitor Caesar's movements and control the key routes into and out of the area. Caesar, always looking for an opportunity to outmaneuver his opponent, decided to lay siege to Pompey's forces. He ordered his legions to construct a series of fortifications around Pompey's camp, intending to cut off his access to supplies and reinforcements. The goal was to starve Pompey's army into submission, forcing them to either surrender or engage Caesar on unfavourable terms. This tactic, though risky, had worked for Caesar in the past, and he believed it could work again at Dyrrhachium. For weeks, the two armies remained locked in a tense standoff. Caesar's men dug trenches and built fortifications, gradually tightening the noose around Pompey's forces. Inside the camp, Pompey's troops were growing restless. Although well provisioned, they were acutely aware of Caesar's reputation for persistence and feared that the siege could drag on indefinitely. Meanwhile, Caesar's army, stretched thin and lacking in adequate supplies, began to suffer from hunger and fatigue. The hot summer weather only exacerbated the situation, and morale among the soldiers began to wane. Pompey, sensing that Caesar's forces were vulnerable, decided to launch a counterattack. He ordered a large-scale assault on Caesar's fortifications, focusing on a weak point in the lines that his scouts had identified. This was the moment Pompey had been waiting for. In a well-coordinated attack, Pompey's legions surged forward, breaking through Caesar's defensive works and overwhelming the Roman soldiers guarding the position. The suddenness and ferocity of the attack caught Caesar's forces off guard, and chaos ensued. As Pompey's forces poured through the breach, Caesar's army began to buckle under the pressure. In the heat of battle, it appeared that Caesar's carefully laid plans were falling apart. His legions, who had grown accustomed to victory under his leadership, were now facing the very real possibility of defeat. Caesar himself, recognizing the danger, rushed to the front lines to rally his troops. He moved among his soldiers, urging them to hold the line and promising that victory was still within their grasp. Despite his best efforts, however, the situation continued to deteriorate. At the height of the battle, Caesar's army was forced to retreat from several key positions. Pompey, sensing victory, pressed the attack, hoping to deliver a crushing blow that would end the war in his favour. Caesar's legions, now fighting for their lives, were pushed back toward the sea. For a brief moment, it seemed that Caesar's entire campaign might collapse. But Caesar, ever the master of strategy, saw an opportunity amid the chaos. Rather than allowing his forces to be routed, he ordered a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions further inland. As Pompey's forces advanced, they found themselves overextended, their supply lines stretched, and their formation disrupted. Caesar, seeing this vulnerability, launched a series of counterattacks on the flanks of Pompey's army. These swift, decisive strikes forced Pompey to halt his advance and regroup. Although Pompey had succeeded in breaking through Caesar's fortifications, he had failed to deliver the knockout blow that he had hoped for. In the aftermath of the battle, both sides found themselves in a stalemate. Pompey had won a tactical victory by breaking Caesar's siege, but he had not been able to destroy Caesar's army. Caesar, on the other hand, had suffered a setback, but had managed to preserve the core of his forces. The Battle of Dyrrhachium, while a serious challenge for Caesar, did not end in the decisive victory that Pompey had anticipated. 10. Realizing that his current position was untenable, Caesar decided to withdraw from Dyrrhachium and regroup. He led his army inland, moving away from the coast and deeper into Greece. Although disappointed by the outcome of the battle, Caesar remained resolute. He knew that the war was far from over, and that the ultimate confrontation with Pompey was still to come. For Pompey, the victory at Dyrrhachium was bittersweet. While he had managed to drive Caesar from the field, he had not dealt the final blow that would have ended the civil war. His forces, though victorious, were still wary of Caesar's ability to recover and regroup. As Pompey prepared for the next phase of the campaign, he knew that Caesar would not give up easily. The Battle of Dyrrhachium was a crucial moment in Caesar's civil war, a reminder that even the greatest commanders can face setbacks. It demonstrated the importance of logistics, terrain and fortifications in ancient warfare, and highlighted the fine balance between victory and defeat. While Pompey had achieved a temporary success, Caesar's resilience and strategic acumen would soon be tested again in one of the most famous battles of the ancient world, the Battle of Pharsalus. The Battle of Pharsalus stands as one of the most iconic and decisive battles in ancient Roman history. Taking place in August 48 BCE, it marked the climax of the civil war between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. What had begun as a struggle for power between two of Rome's most powerful men culminated in a battle that would shape the future of Rome itself. For Caesar, Pharsalus represented a gamble, an all-or-nothing clash against a much larger and well-supplied enemy force. For Pompey, it was supposed to be the final blow that would put an end to Caesar's ambitions and restore order to the Roman Republic. However, as history unfolded, Pharsalus would instead be the beginning of the end for Pompey and his supporters. After the inconclusive Battle of Dyrrhachium, both Caesar and Pompey regrouped in Greece. Pompey, confident after his minor victory at Dyrrhachium, hoped to lure Caesar into a decisive confrontation in a position of his choosing. He had the advantage: a far larger army, better resources, and strong backing from the Senate. His army consisted of over 50,000 legionaries, bolstered by auxiliary forces from Rome's eastern provinces, along with a formidable cavalry force nearly 7 times larger than Caesar's. The seasoned veterans of his legions were reinforced by recruits from the nobility, many of whom were loyal to Pompey due to family ties and political alliances. Caesar's forces, on the other hand, were significantly outnumbered, totaling only about 22,000 legionaries. These men, however, had been through years of battle under Caesar's leadership in Gaul and had proven their loyalty and skill time and time again. They were tired, short on supplies, and exhausted from their rapid march to engage Pompey, but their experience and discipline would prove crucial. Despite their disadvantage in numbers and resources, Caesar remained confident. His belief in his troops, combined with his bold tactics, would turn the tide of the conflict. The two armies finally faced each other near the town of Pharsalus, in the fertile plains of central Greece. Pompey, relying on traditional Roman military doctrine, positioned his forces with their backs to the river Enipeus, effectively securing his rear and ensuring that his troops could not retreat. His plan was to use his vastly superior cavalry to overwhelm Caesar's smaller force, flank his infantry, and crush them with a pincer movement. On the surface, it was a sound plan. By deploying his cavalry on the wings and massing his legionaries in the centre, Pompey believed that once his cavalry broke through Caesar's lines, the battle would be over swiftly. Caesar, on the other hand, understood the limitations of his own force. He couldn't win by conventional means, and he needed to innovate if he were to stand a chance. He placed his infantry in a traditional formation, with his legions forming 3 lines. However, he kept his elite 10th Legion, the soldiers who had fought with him in Gaul, stationed at his right flank. Anticipating Pompey's reliance on cavalry, Caesar devised a plan to counter the expected flank attack. In addition to his cavalry and infantry, he positioned a 4th line, consisting of 2,000 of his best soldiers, slightly behind his right flank. These men were instructed to remain hidden until Pompey's cavalry charge began. As dawn broke over the plains of Pharsalus, the two armies took their positions. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting long shadows across the battlefield. For many of the men on both sides, this would be their last day. The tension was palpable. Roman legions, once united under the banner of the Republic, now stood divided, poised to destroy one another. Pompey's forces, confident in their overwhelming numbers, awaited the signal to attack. The battle began with the traditional Roman advance, as Pompey's legionaries marched toward Caesar's lines. Caesar, however, held his troops back, keeping them stationary, conserving their energy. Pompey's forces advanced in unison, but Caesar's troops remained in their positions until they were close enough for effective engagement. When the battle finally began, Caesar's troops rushed forward, crashing into Pompey's front lines. The fighting was brutal, with both sides exchanging blows in a tightly packed melee. As expected, Pompey's cavalry, commanded by Titus Labienus, one of Caesar's former lieutenants who had defected to Pompey's side, charged Caesar's right flank. Caesar's outnumbered cavalry retreated, drawing Pompey's horsemen further from the main battle. It was then that Caesar's hidden fourth line, composed of infantry armed with pila, throwing spears, revealed itself. These men were ordered to target Pompey's horsemen directly, thrusting their pila into the faces of the cavalry, a tactic designed to disrupt the cohesion of the mounted troops. The tactic worked brilliantly. Pompey's cavalry, caught off guard by this unexpected maneuver, began to fall into disarray. Labienus tried to regroup his forces, but the damage had already been done. Pompey's cavalry broke, fleeing the battlefield. This was a turning point in the battle. Without cavalry support, Pompey's infantry was exposed on both flanks, and Caesar quickly exploited this vulnerability. Caesar ordered his right flank to press the attack, pushing forward into the gap left by Pompey's fleeing cavalry. At this critical moment, Caesar's battle-hardened legions, who had fought alongside him for years in Gaul, took advantage of the chaos. His elite 10th Legion, known for its discipline and ferocity in battle, surged forward, flanking Pompey's infantry. With no cavalry to defend their flanks, Pompey's legions began to falter. Pompey, observing the breakdown of his cavalry and the pressure on his infantry, was paralyzed by indecision. He had always relied on his strategic mind and careful planning, but now, faced with the unpredictable nature of battle, he hesitated to commit any reserves. As Caesar's forces began to envelop his legions, Pompey's troops, who had initially been confident in their numbers, started to panic. Without orders from their commander, and with the pressure of Caesar's relentless attack, Pompey's army began to break. The pivotal moment came when Caesar's fourth line of reserves, who had remained relatively unengaged, charged forward to complete the encirclement of Pompey's forces. Caesar's army, outnumbered but emboldened by their commander's presence and strategic brilliance, pressed their advantage. The battlefield was now a sea of confusion, with Pompey's legions retreating in disarray. The once mighty force that Pompey had assembled began to dissolve into a chaotic retreat. Caesar's legions pursued the fleeing Pompeian soldiers, cutting them down as they attempted to escape. For many of Pompey's men, surrender was not an option. They had committed themselves to a cause they believed was just, and now, with Caesar's forces victorious, they knew that defeat would mean death or capture. The carnage was immense. Thousands of Pompeian soldiers were killed in the rout, and thousands more were captured. Pompey himself, seeing the hopelessness of the situation, fled the battlefield. He had lost his army, and with it his best chance of defeating Caesar. Accompanied by a few loyal followers, Pompey fled to the coast, where he hoped to escape by sea. His destination was Egypt, a kingdom ruled by the young Ptolemy III, who Pompey believed would offer him sanctuary. The aftermath of the Battle of Pharsalus was a momentous turning point in Roman history. Caesar had not only defeated Pompey, his greatest rival, but had also cemented his control over the Roman Republic. The victory at Pharsalus was as much psychological as it was military. Caesar's reputation as an invincible commander was now firmly established, and his ability to outthink and outfight a larger, better-supplied army was a testament to his strategic genius. As Caesar surveyed the battlefield, he knew that the civil war was far from over. While Pharsalus had been a decisive victory, Pompey's supporters still controlled significant territories, and the Senate, though weakened, had not yet been fully brought to heel. Caesar would need to continue his campaign, But for the moment he had achieved what many believed was impossible. He had defeated the great Pompey the Great in open battle. Pompey's fate, however, was not one of a dignified retreat. After arriving in Egypt, he sought refuge with Ptolemy III, hoping that the Egyptian king would offer him the support he needed to rebuild his forces. Instead, in a bid to win favour with Caesar, Ptolemy's advisers betrayed Pompey. As Pompey disembarked from his ship, he was ambushed and assassinated by Ptolemy's men. His body was left to rot on the shore, a tragic and ignoble end for one of Rome's greatest generals. When Caesar arrived in Egypt shortly after, he was presented with Pompey's severed head as a trophy. However, Caesar was not pleased. Despite their rivalry, Caesar had once considered Pompey a friend and had hoped to offer him clemency, much as he had done with other defeated enemies. Pompey's assassination was a stark reminder of the ruthless politics of the time and the lengths to which men would go in their pursuit of power. The Battle of Pharsalus was not just the defeat of one man, but the end of an era in Roman history. With Pompey gone, Caesar now stood unchallenged as the most powerful man in Rome. But while the battle was over, the aftermath of Pharsalus would ripple through Roman politics for years to come. Caesar's consolidation of power would lead to the eventual fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. For Caesar, the victory at Pharsalus was a validation of everything he had fought for. His army, loyal and battle-hardened, had followed him through impossible odds, and together they had defeated the combined might of the Senate's forces. Following his decisive victory over Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus, Julius Caesar pursued his former rival across the Mediterranean. Pompey's flight took him to Egypt, a kingdom with its own internal turmoil. Hoping for sanctuary, Pompey instead met his demise at the hands of the Egyptian court, where he was assassinated on the orders of Ptolemy the Thean's advisers. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria in October 48 BCE, he was presented with Pompey's severed head. While his rival's death had removed one major obstacle, Caesar's time in Egypt was far from peaceful. His arrival in Egypt coincided with a bitter struggle for the throne between the young Ptolemy XIII and his sister, Cleopatra VII. Egypt, despite its internal conflict, remained a wealthy and strategically important kingdom. For Caesar, securing Egypt meant stabilizing the eastern Mediterranean and gaining access to its immense resources, particularly grain. Cleopatra, ambitious and shrewd, saw in Caesar not just a powerful ally, but also an opportunity to secure her place on the throne. The civil war between Cleopatra and Ptolemy III had divided Egypt, and Caesar, ever the opportunist, became embroiled in the conflict. Caesar initially intended to remain neutral in the Egyptian civil war, but political dynamics quickly shifted, pulling him into the fray. Cleopatra, sensing an opportunity, smuggled herself into Caesar's quarters in Alexandria, famously rolled in a carpet. Her beauty, charisma and political cunning immediately won Caesar's favour. Cleopatra argued her case before the Roman general, asking for his support to reclaim the throne. Caesar, impressed by her intelligence and charm, agreed to mediate the dispute between Cleopatra and her brother. He ordered both Ptolemy III and Cleopatra to come before him to settle the matter. However, Ptolemy XIII's advisers, particularly the influential eunuch Pothinus, had no intention of allowing Caesar to dictate terms. Recognizing Caesar's support for Cleopatra as a threat, they began preparing for war. Ptolemy's forces soon laid siege to the royal palace in Alexandria, where Caesar and Cleopatra had taken refuge. Thus began the siege of Alexandria, a protracted and dangerous conflict that would last for several months. Caesar, caught in a foreign land with only a small contingent of troops, found himself in a precarious situation. Ptolemy's forces vastly outnumbered his, and Alexandria's population was largely hostile to the Romans. The city was a hotbed of tension, with riots breaking out and street battles becoming common as Caesar's forces tried to maintain control. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Caesar's experience and leadership held his small force together. One of the key elements of the siege was the struggle for control of the great harbour of Alexandria. The harbour was critical for maintaining Caesar's supply lines and preventing Ptolemy's forces from cutting off his escape. Caesar, recognizing this, focused much of his energy on securing the harbour. In a daring move, he ordered his forces to seize the lighthouse of Pharos, which controlled access to the harbour. The Pharos lighthouse was one of the great wonders of the ancient world, towering over the harbour and providing a strategic vantage point. The capture of Pharos was not easy. Caesar's men faced fierce resistance from Ptolemy's forces, who understood the importance of the lighthouse. In the ensuing battle, Caesar personally led an assault on the lighthouse, risking his life in the front lines. Though the fighting was brutal, Caesar's forces ultimately succeeded in capturing the Pharos, securing their control of the harbour and preventing a naval blockade. However, this victory came at a cost. Caesar's fleet was burned during the fighting, and much of the city, including parts of the famous Library of Alexandria, was destroyed in the fires that raged during the siege. Despite the difficulties, Caesar continued to hold out in Alexandria, waiting for reinforcements. Cleopatra, meanwhile, remained by his side, consolidating her influence over the Roman general. The two became lovers, and their relationship would have long-lasting political consequences. Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar not only helped her secure the throne, but also ensured that Egypt would remain under Roman influence for decades to come. As the siege dragged on, Ptolemy XIII's forces made several attempts to break Caesar's defences. The fighting was brutal, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Caesar's small contingent of Roman legionaries, though vastly outnumbered, used their superior discipline and tactics to hold off the Egyptians. The streets of Alexandria became a battlefield, with Roman soldiers engaging in hand-to-hand combat with Ptolemy's troops. Finally, after several months of siege, reinforcements arrived for Caesar. A Roman fleet, commanded by Mithridates of Pergamum, arrived from Asia Minor, bringing fresh troops and supplies. With these reinforcements, Caesar launched a counterattack, breaking the siege and driving Ptolemy's forces from Alexandria. In the final confrontation, Ptolemy XIII attempted to flee, but drowned in the Nile while trying to escape. With Ptolemy dead and the siege broken, Cleopatra was restored to the throne as the sole ruler of Egypt, with her younger brother Ptolemy XIV as her co-ruler. However, it was clear to all that Cleopatra now ruled with Caesar's backing, making her position secure. Caesar's victory in Egypt not only stabilized the region, but also secured a powerful ally in Cleopatra, whose relationship with Caesar would continue to shape Roman and Egyptian politics in the years to come. The siege of Alexandria marked a significant chapter in Caesar's career. Although it was a hard-fought and costly conflict, it demonstrated Caesar's ability to adapt to challenging circumstances and his willingness to become involved in the complex politics of the Eastern Mediterranean. His relationship with Cleopatra, forged in the fires of war, would have long-lasting implications for both Rome and Egypt. For Cleopatra, the siege was a triumph that secured her throne. For Caesar, it was another step toward consolidating his power, even as new challenges awaited him back in Rome. Following his victory in Egypt, Julius Caesar's next challenge arose in the eastern provinces of the Roman Republic, where a former adversary, King Pharnaces II of Pontus, was threatening Roman-controlled territories. The son of the infamous Mithridates VI, Pharnaces sought to reclaim his father's kingdom and exploit Rome's civil war to his advantage. After swiftly consolidating control over Pontus and parts of Armenia, Pharnaces posed a significant threat to Roman rule in the region. Caesar, determined to prevent the rise of another formidable enemy, swiftly marched his army from Alexandria to confront Pharnaces in modern-day Turkey, culminating in the famous Battle of Zela. Pharnaces had taken advantage of the chaos in the Roman world as Caesar battled Pompey and his supporters across the Mediterranean. With Caesar focused on his campaigns in Greece and Egypt, Pharnaces saw an opportunity to extend his dominion in the east. He seized the strategic Roman provinces of Pontus and Armenia Minor, defeating a Roman garrison at Nicopolis. Roman control of the region appeared to be slipping, and Pharnaces declared himself the rightful ruler of the territories his father had once ruled. His ambition was bold, but it would soon bring him face to face with Caesar's military genius. Upon hearing of Pharnaces' advances, Caesar wasted no time in addressing the situation. With Pompey defeated and Cleopatra's throne secured in Egypt, he saw the eastern threat as his next priority. Although tired from previous campaigns, Caesar's legions remained disciplined and battle-hardened. He gathered a small but elite force and made his way to the region of Pontus, determined to crush Pharnaces before he could further expand his influence. The rapid pace at which Caesar moved took Pharnaces by surprise, and it would ultimately be one of the key factors that led to his downfall. In early August 47 BCE, the two forces met near the town of Zela, not far from where Mithridates had once fought the Romans. The location held symbolic importance for Pharnaces, who believed he could emulate his father's victories. However, Caesar was no ordinary Roman general. Despite the limited size of his force, Caesar had confidence in the discipline and experience of his legions. Pharnaces, for his part, commanded a larger force, bolstered by Scythian cavalry and local mercenaries. He believed his superior numbers and familiarity with the terrain would give him the upper hand. Pharnaces' troops occupied a strong defensive position on a hill, which he hoped would make it difficult for Caesar to launch a successful attack. Pharnaces, believing he had the advantage, prepared for a defensive battle. His army was entrenched on high ground, and he expected Caesar to either hesitate or be forced into a difficult uphill assault. However, Caesar, always one to take the initiative, was determined to dictate the terms of the engagement. He refused to let Pharnaces control the tempo of the battle. Rather than wait for a prolonged siege or reconnaissance, Caesar boldly ordered his troops to engage Pharnaces' forces immediately. His confidence in the discipline and capability of his legions allowed him to take such risks, and this aggressive strategy would soon pay dividends. The battle began swiftly and with great intensity. Caesar's legions, despite being outnumbered, advanced up the hill with precision. The Roman infantry, well-drilled and battle-hardened from years of campaigns, showed their discipline as they climbed toward the enemy positions. Pharnaces, caught off guard by Caesar's rapid approach, ordered his troops to mount a counterattack. His Scythian cavalry and mercenaries charged down the hill, hoping to break the Roman advance. But Caesar's legions held firm, using their superior training and close formation to absorb the shock of the initial attack. The clash between the Roman infantry and Pharnaces' cavalry was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties in the opening moments of the battle. The hill made maneuvering difficult, but Caesar's soldiers, experienced in fighting in difficult terrain, used their shields and spears to great effect, pushing back Pharnaces' cavalry. The tide of the battle began to turn in Caesar's favour as his legions gained ground, inching their way up the hill and forcing Pharnaces' troops back toward their defensive positions. Pharnaces, realizing that his cavalry was unable to break the Roman lines, attempted to rally his infantry. His forces, which included a mix of local levies and seasoned veterans, were soon locked in brutal hand-to-hand combat with Caesar's legions. Despite their numerical superiority, Pharnaces' troops struggled to match the discipline and tactical coordination of the Roman soldiers. Caesar's troops, fighting in tight formations, steadily pushed the enemy back, methodically advancing despite the difficult terrain. The Roman skill with their gladi, short swords, allowed them to inflict heavy losses on Pharnaces' infantry, who were poorly equipped to deal with the close-quarters fighting. As the battle wore on, Caesar's superior command became increasingly evident. His ability to adapt to the changing dynamics of the battlefield, combined with his relentless drive to seize the initiative, placed immense pressure on Pharnaces. The king, who had hoped to repeat his father's success against the Romans, found himself facing a far more capable and determined adversary than he had anticipated. Caesar's bold decision to engage Pharnaces head-on, rather than wait for reinforcements or more favourable conditions, caught the Pontic king off guard and forced him into a defensive position from which he could not recover. As the day wore on, Pharnaces' army began to crumble under the relentless Roman assault. Caesar's legions, having fought uphill and through waves of enemy attacks, finally broke through the enemy lines. Pharnaces, realizing that his position was untenable, attempted to retreat with the remnants of his forces. However, the Roman cavalry pursued the fleeing soldiers, cutting down many as they attempted to escape. Pharnaces himself managed to flee the battlefield, but would later be killed in another skirmish while attempting to regroup his forces in the eastern provinces. The battle was over almost as quickly as it had begun. In a matter of hours, Caesar had decisively defeated Pharnaces, securing a swift and overwhelming victory. The speed and efficiency of Caesar's campaign led to his famous comment, "Veni, vidi, vici." I came, I saw, I conquered. This simple yet profound statement encapsulated the ease with which Caesar had overcome what many believed to be a formidable opponent. The victory at Zela was a testament to Caesar's military genius, his ability to strike quickly and decisively, and his refusal to let his enemies dictate the terms of battle. The consequences of the Battle of Zela were significant for both Caesar and the Roman Republic. With Pharnaces defeated, Caesar secured Roman control over the eastern provinces and eliminated a potential threat to his rule. The victory further enhanced his reputation as an invincible general, capable of defeating enemies quickly and efficiently, even when outnumbered. It also sent a clear message to any other potential challengers that Caesar's dominance over the Roman world was not to be questioned. His ability to achieve such a swift and complete victory cemented his legacy as one of history's greatest military commanders. For Pharnaces, the battle marked the end of his ambitions to restore the kingdom of Pontus. His defeat at Zela ensured that the region would remain firmly under Roman control, and his death in the aftermath of the battle extinguished any hope of a Mithridatic resurgence. The battle also highlighted the futility of opposing Caesar, whose strategic brilliance and willingness to act decisively had once again proven to be a winning formula on the battlefield. The Battle of Zela was not the largest or bloodiest battle of Caesar's career, but it was one of the most significant in terms of the speed and decisiveness with which it was won. Caesar's victory further solidified his control over the Roman Republic and demonstrated his ability to handle multiple threats on different fronts. While the battle is often remembered for the famous phrase "Veni, vidi, vici," it was also a clear example of Caesar's tactical acumen and his ability to inspire and lead his legions to victory under challenging circumstances. With the defeat of Pharnaces, Caesar could now turn his attention back to the ongoing political struggles in Rome. The civil war was not yet over, and although Caesar had secured victories on multiple fronts, he knew that there were still enemies to be defeated and challenges to overcome. But for now, at least, the threat from the east had been neutralized, and Caesar could once again claim to have saved the Republic from an external enemy. After years of intense civil war, Julius Caesar's dominance over the Roman Republic was nearing its final stages. While Caesar had decisively defeated Pompey the Great at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE and pursued Pompey's allies across the Mediterranean, pockets of resistance still remained. One of the last bastions of opposition to Caesar lay in North Africa, where the remnants of Pompey's supporters, including Metellus Scipio and King Juba I of Numidia, sought to resist Caesar's control. This conflict would culminate in the Battle of Thapsus, a critical engagement that effectively brought an end to organized resistance against Caesar in Africa. The build-up to the Battle of Thapsus began with the regrouping of Pompeian forces in North Africa. After Pharsalus, many of Pompey's loyalists fled to the region, where they found refuge under the protection of King Juba I, a staunch ally of Pompey. Juba, who ruled the Numidian kingdom, had long harbored animosity towards Caesar. The two had clashed in earlier campaigns, and Juba had aligned himself with the Senate's conservative faction, which was largely opposed to Caesar's ambitions. After the defeat of Pompey, Juba became one of the leading figures in the anti-Caesarian resistance, working alongside Metellus Scipio, the appointed commander of the remaining Republican forces. Metellus Scipio, a former consul and one of the staunchest supporters of the Senate's cause, had fled to Africa after the defeat at Pharsalus. He quickly established a base of operations in the city of Thapsus, located near modern-day Tunisia. The Pompeian forces in Africa were bolstered by Juba's Numidian cavalry, as well as Roman legions that had once fought for Pompey. Despite the loss of their leader, the Republican forces still held out hope that they could turn the tide against Caesar with the support of local allies and the strategic advantages of the North African landscape. As news of the Pompeian regrouping in North Africa reached Caesar, he decided to bring the fight to his enemies once more. Having secured victory in Egypt and neutralized the threat posed by Pharnaces the Second in Pontus, Caesar now turned his attention to Africa. He sailed from Sicily in December 47 BCE, landing in North Africa with a large force composed of seasoned legions, veterans from earlier campaigns, and fresh recruits eager to prove themselves. Caesar's army was well supplied and motivated, and Caesar himself was determined to crush the remnants of the Republican forces once and for all. Upon arriving in Africa, Caesar's initial encounters with the Pompeian forces were skirmishes and smaller engagements. The Republicans, under Metellus Scipio's command, sought to delay Caesar's advance, using guerrilla tactics and attempting to draw him into the difficult desert terrain. However, Caesar, ever the strategist, refused to be drawn into a protracted campaign in the desert. Instead, he focused on forcing a decisive engagement near the city of Thapsus, where the Republican forces had concentrated their strength. By April 46 BCE, both armies were ready for battle. Caesar's forces, numbering around 60,000 men, were composed of several legions, including veterans of his campaigns in Gaul and the Civil War. These were seasoned troops who had fought under Caesar's command for years and were well versed in his strategies and tactics. Opposing them was a mixed force of Pompeian legions, Numidian cavalry, and local levies, led by Metellus Scipio and supported by King Juba's Numidian army. One of the key advantages held by the Republican forces was their elephant corps, a formidable unit that had been supplied by Juba. These war elephants were intended to break through Caesar's lines and cause panic among his infantry. The use of elephants in ancient warfare was often a psychological tactic as much as a physical one. The sight and sound of these massive creatures could terrify even the most disciplined soldiers. However, Caesar had faced war elephants before, most notably during his campaigns in Spain and Gaul, and he was not unprepared for this challenge. The battle began with both armies arrayed across the plains outside Thapsus. Caesar, as always, took personal command of his forces, positioning his legions in a traditional Roman formation with infantry in the centre and cavalry on the wings. Caesar's right wing was particularly strong, consisting of elite cohorts and a contingent of archers and slingers whose role would be crucial in dealing with the elephants. Metellus Scipio and King Juba, on the other hand, deployed their forces in a defensive posture, hoping to lure Caesar into a frontal assault that would play into their strength. Caesar, however, had no intention of falling into such a trap. Recognizing the threat posed by the elephants, he ordered his archers and light infantry to target the animals with arrows and javelins, aiming to wound and disorient them before they could charge the Roman lines. This strategy proved effective, as the elephants, once injured and panicked, turned back toward their own lines, causing confusion and chaos among the Republican ranks. Some of the elephants charged into the Numidian cavalry, breaking their formation and leaving a gap in the Pompeian defences. With the elephants neutralized, Caesar ordered a full advance. His legions surged forward, their shields locked in formation, as they marched across the battlefield toward the enemy. The Numidian cavalry, now disorganized and leaderless, attempted to regroup, but it was too late. Caesar's cavalry, led by his trusted lieutenants, swept around the enemy's flanks, cutting down any who attempted to flee. The Republican infantry, now fully exposed, fought desperately to hold their ground, but they were no match for the discipline and experience of Caesar's legions. Caesar himself was in the thick of the fighting, rallying his troops and directing the assault with his usual energy and charisma. As the battle raged, it became clear that Metellus Scipio and King Juba had lost control of their forces. Their army began to disintegrate under the relentless pressure of Caesar's attack. As Caesar's forces closed in on the Republican stronghold at Thapsus, Metellus Scipio attempted a final stand. However, his efforts were in vain. The Roman legions, now fully committed to the assault, breached the city's defences and overran the remaining resistance. Metellus Scipio, realizing that defeat was imminent, chose to take his own life rather than face capture by Caesar. King Juba, too, fled the battlefield, only to be killed shortly afterward. The Republican cause in North Africa was effectively crushed, and with it, any hope of continuing the civil war against Caesar. The Battle of Thapsus was a decisive and bloody engagement, with estimates suggesting that over 10,000 Pompeian soldiers were killed in the fighting. Caesar's forces, by contrast, suffered relatively few casualties, a testament to the superiority of their tactics and training. For Caesar, the victory at Thapsus was a significant step toward consolidating his control over the Roman Republic. With the defeat of the Pompeian forces in Africa, only a few scattered remnants of resistance remained, most notably in Spain, where Gnaeus Pompeius, the son of Pompey the Great, would continue the fight. In the aftermath of the battle, Caesar showed little mercy to his enemies. Many of the surviving Republican commanders were captured and executed, including Faustus Cornelius Sulla, the son of the former dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla. King Juba's territory was annexed by Rome, and Numidia was reorganized as a Roman province. Caesar's harsh treatment of his defeated foes at Thapsus marked a departure from his earlier policy of clemency, which he had extended to many of his opponents after Pharsalus. Perhaps the prolonged civil war and the personal animosities that had developed during the conflict had hardened Caesar's resolve. The consequences of the Battle of Thapsus were far-reaching. With the defeat of the Pompeian forces in North Africa, Caesar was now the undisputed master of the Roman world. His victory paved the way for his return to Rome, where he would be hailed as a hero and granted unprecedented honours, including the title of Dictator Perpetuo, or Dictator for life. However, this concentration of power would also sow the seeds of his eventual downfall, as many in the Senate feared that Caesar's ambition would lead to the end of the Republic. For now, though, Caesar's dominance was complete. The Battle of Thapsus marked the end of organized resistance to his rule in Africa, and with his enemies defeated, Caesar could turn his attention to the final stages of the civil war. The victory at Thapsus was a testament to Caesar's military genius and his ability to inspire loyalty and discipline among his troops. It was also a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, Caesar's legions remained one of the most formidable military forces in the ancient world. The Battle of Thapsus stands as a pivotal moment in Caesar's rise to power, and a key turning point in the history of Rome. With this victory, the path was clear for Caesar to return to Rome and shape the future of the Republic, for better or for worse. The Battle of Munda, fought in 45 BCE, was the last and most decisive conflict of Julius Caesar's civil war, marking the final defeat of the Pompeian forces. The battle took place in southern Spain, a region that had long been a stronghold of Pompey the Great's supporters. After Caesar's victory at Pharsalus in 48 BCE and Pompey's subsequent assassination, the Pompeian faction was left fragmented but not entirely broken. Pompey's sons, Gnaeus Pompeius and Sextus Pompeius, took up their father's cause and rallied the remaining supporters in Hispania, modern Spain, determined to continue the resistance against Caesar. The Battle of Munda would see the end of this opposition. By early 45 BCE, Caesar had nearly consolidated his power over the Roman world. However, the Pompeians still posed a significant threat in Hispania, where they had gathered a formidable force of around 50,000 troops, including veterans from previous campaigns and local Spanish levies. The Pompeians had chosen their battleground carefully. They occupied a strong defensive position in Munda, a town surrounded by rugged terrain and hills that gave them the advantage of the high ground. Caesar, commanding an army of about 40,000 men, including 8 veteran legions, was determined to put an end to the civil war once and for all. The campaign had been difficult. The Pompeians had harassed Caesar's forces using guerrilla tactics, disrupting supply lines and ambushing detachments. But Caesar, with his characteristic persistence and strategic genius, pressed on. As Caesar's army approached Munda, both sides prepared for the decisive confrontation. The Pompeians, led by Gnaeus Pompeius, were well positioned on a ridge, which provided them with a strong defensive advantage. Their forces were also bolstered by the presence of Titus Labienus, a former loyal lieutenant of Caesar, who had defected to the Pompeian side earlier in the war. Labienus was an experienced and capable commander, and his defection had been a significant blow to Caesar. Now, he commanded the Pompeian cavalry and played a crucial role in the defence of Munda. Caesar, on the other hand, was fully aware that his army would have to fight uphill against a well-entrenched enemy. It was a dangerous situation, one where the advantage lay heavily in the hands of the Pompeians. But Caesar had no choice. He needed to engage them. The civil war had already dragged on for years, and a decisive victory here would finally bring it to an end. For the Pompeians, this was their last stand. Failure at Munda would mean the complete collapse of their cause. The battle began with Caesar's legions advancing uphill toward the Pompeian positions. The terrain was difficult, and the Pompeians poured a relentless barrage of projectiles, arrows, slings and javelins onto the advancing Roman soldiers. Despite the intense pressure, Caesar's veterans, battle-hardened from years of campaigning, pushed forward. However, the uphill assault took its toll. Caesar's soldiers struggled to maintain momentum, and as the battle raged on, they began to falter. The Pompeians, seeing an opportunity to break Caesar's lines, launched several counterattacks. Labienus, commanding the Pompeian cavalry, led these attacks with precision, causing significant disruption in Caesar's ranks. At one point, it seemed as though the battle might turn in favour of the Pompeians. Caesar's forces, exhausted and demoralised by the unrelenting attacks from above, began to lose ground. Caesar, sensing the critical nature of the situation, made a bold and decisive move. Despite his age, he was in his mid-50s at the time, he donned his distinctive red cloak, the mark of a Roman general, and rode to the front lines. Caesar's presence on the battlefield electrified his soldiers. Seeing their general leading from the front, they rallied and redoubled their efforts. With renewed determination, Caesar's legions pressed forward once more, engaging the Pompeians in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The fighting was intense, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Slowly but surely, Caesar's forces began to gain ground, pushing the Pompeians back toward their fortified positions. However, the battle remained fiercely contested. Caesar's soldiers had not yet broken through the Pompeian lines, and the outcome was still uncertain. At this crucial juncture, Caesar ordered his cavalry to strike the flanks of the Pompeian army. This maneuver, executed with precision, created a gap in the Pompeian lines. Caesar's legions quickly exploited this breach, driving a wedge into the heart of the Pompeian defences. The Pompeians, now under pressure from both the front and the flanks, began to lose cohesion. Caesar's troops surged forward, breaking through the enemy lines and overwhelming the Pompeian defenders. The Pompeian army, once so formidable, began to disintegrate under the relentless assault. Gnaeus Pompeius, realizing that the battle was lost, attempted to flee the battlefield. However, Caesar's cavalry pursued him and his men relentlessly. Thousands of Pompeian soldiers were cut down as they fled, and the once proud army of Pompey the Great was utterly destroyed. Gnaeus Pompeius managed to escape the battlefield, but his respite was short-lived. Caesar's forces tracked him down in the weeks following the battle, and he was captured and executed. His brother, Sextus Pompeius, also fled, but continued to resist Caesar's rule for a few more years. Sextus eventually became a notorious pirate, harassing Roman shipping in the Mediterranean before being captured and killed. The Battle of Munda was one of Caesar's bloodiest and hardest-fought victories. The Pompeians had put up a fierce resistance, and for a time it had seemed as though they might succeed in turning the tide of the war. However, Caesar's leadership, tactical genius, and the loyalty of his veterans ultimately prevailed. The battle marked the end of organized opposition to Caesar's rule and brought the civil war to a close. For Caesar, the victory at Munda was both a personal and political triumph. He returned to Rome as the undisputed master of the Roman world, hailed as a hero by the people and granted numerous honours by the Senate. Among these was the title of Dictator Perpetuo, or Dictator for Life, a title that would soon have dire consequences. The concentration of power in Caesar's hands, coupled with his decision to accept the title of Dictator for Life, alarmed many in the Senate, who feared that he intended to dismantle the Republic and establish a monarchy. This fear would eventually lead to his assassination on the Ides of March in 44 BCE, just a year after his victory at Mundi. The Battle of Munda also had significant long-term consequences for the Roman state. With the Pompeians defeated, there were no longer any serious rivals to Caesar's power. The Republic, which had already been weakened by years of civil war, was effectively dead. Although Caesar's assassination would briefly throw the Roman world into chaos, it did not restore the Republic. Instead, Caesar's death paved the way for his adopted heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, to rise to power. Octavian would go on to establish the Roman Empire, bringing an end to the Republic and inaugurating a new era of imperial rule. For Caesar's soldiers, the victory at Munda was the culmination of years of loyalty and service. These men had followed Caesar through some of the most challenging campaigns in Roman history, from the conquest of Gaul to the civil war against Pompey. They had fought on battlefields across the Mediterranean, from the plains of Pharsalus to the deserts of North Africa. The battle-hardened veterans who had stood by Caesar through thick and thin were now witness to his ultimate triumph. They had helped secure his position as the most powerful man in the Roman world, and in return they were richly rewarded. Many of Caesar's soldiers were given land, titles and wealth as a reward for their service. The Battle of Munda is often overshadowed by other, more famous battles in Caesar's career, such as Pharsalus and Thapsus, but it remains one of the most important engagements in Roman history. It marked the final defeat of the Pompeian faction and the end of the civil war, but it also signalled the end of the Republic. With no rivals left to challenge his authority, Caesar's victory at Munda paved the way for the establishment of the Roman Empire, an empire that would endure for centuries.